Hello, everyone. My name is McCord, and I'm super excited to be with you all today as we talk about not being our trauma. That's right, y'all. Today, we are going to talk about I am not my trauma, reimagining and re identifying you. And so, just a little bit about me. Again, my name is McCord. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of New Jersey and an approved clinical supervisor. I'm also the CEO and clinical director of Oasis Wellness Group located here in New Jersey, where we are a group practice and just recently expanded into providing intensive and community services and behavior assistance services as well. I am currently in pursuit of my PhD in counselor education and supervision. I'm also a licensed minister, so I marry my clinical work with my spiritual work often. I've been in the mental health field for 11 years now, with 5 years of that being in group practice. And I'm also a speaker, workshop facilitator, and author. And so let's talk a little bit about today. So, the goal of today's presentation is to impart understanding of how trauma shapes our identity, right? We want to talk about how we take on what I call a trauma identity when we go through those difficult experiences, and to be able to offer you some tips on how you can reimagine and re-identify your life, right? The goal is to reset mindsets about generational trauma in ourself, our family, and society, and to establish some new ideas about how we can begin to disrupt this generational trauma through re-identifying and reimagining ourselves. And so the goal is not to place any blame, shame, attack, or condemn on anybody, any individual, any group of people, right? We are working to bring awareness. We don't intentionally try and be offenders, but sometimes due to our own not knowing, we can unintentionally offend. And so it's important that I always lay out the disclaimer and start my presentations by letting us know what our goal is, and that our goal is not to attack, shame, blame, or offend, right? But our goal is to be able to bring awareness and to impart knowledge. And so I often understand that the material and subject matter that we talk about can be very triggering. And so if at any point you feel that you're having a strong emotional reaction to the presentation, it is absolutely okay to take a break. It is absolutely okay to step away. It is absolutely okay to sign off and then act self-awareness and take care of you, right? Practicing self-awareness throughout this presentation. And if at any time any negative emotional reactions come up, I'm asking you to please take care of you and know what you can and cannot handle in the moment. It's absolutely okay. It's necessary and it is highly encouraged. And so we're going to start by jumping in and talking about what trauma is. We don't want to make any assumptions that everybody actually understands what trauma is, right? And so, according to the American Psychological Association, they define trauma as an emotional response, but through research and discoveries, we also see that trauma is a physiological response, and trauma also lives in a body. Some of us may have heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? It's a book. If you have not heard of the book, I do encourage you to pick it up and read it. It talks about how trauma lives in our body. So even when our mind works to forget, our body will still have reactions to different triggers from things that we've been traumatized about, right? And so trauma often lives in a body. So as we work on trying to release trauma from our minds, we also need to be doing the work to try to release trauma from our bodies as well, right? We also understand that trauma is experienced relatively and not absolutely. So, what does this mean? It means that trauma is relative and not absolute. So, in other words, it's dependent on the person who is experiencing it and their ability to cope with it, right? It depends on who you are, what your life experiences are, and many other factors. Two people could experience the same exact distressing event and react in two completely opposite ways. Two people could have been in the same exact car and had the same exact car accident, and one person walked away and they're ready to drive and hit the road again, and the other person may have this fear that overtook them and they never want to drive again, right? And so we can never assume that because someone has faced trauma that it's going to look the same. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. It is about the person and what their life experiences are, with their abilities to cope, what they have experienced in their life. And so that's extremely important to understand about trauma, right? Especially when we're talking about not being our trauma and reimagining, re-identifying us. One of the mistakes that we can make in understanding trauma is that we will try to do the same things that somebody else does, right? We'll try to compare our situation to the next person who may have experienced trauma. We can't do that because everybody's situation is unique, right? We also can't assume the severity or presence of trauma based off of the event, but on the individual who experienced it. So, what am I saying? I may have been in a car accident and my car may have been totaled. And I may see that as like the most devastating, traumatic situation that I ever been through. But somebody else may have been in a car accident and the car was totaled, and they don't necessarily feel the same level of severity as that, right? It may be not that big of a deal to that person. And so it's okay for us to allow people. The important part is to define trauma for yourself, right? Define it for yourself. You cannot allow anyone else to define it for you, nor can you define it for anybody else. One of the biggest mistakes that we can do is trying to use somebody else's measure and stick. We have an overall understanding what trauma is, but it has to be defined for yourself, because when you define it for yourself, that's what's going to help you to overcome it, right? And then trauma can be personal, it can be societal, it can be family, familial, or generational, right? So what does that mean? We can experience trauma personally, meaning to our person. We can experience trauma within our society, right? All we have to do is look around, right? For the last 3 years, and we've seen societal trauma through COVID-19. We've seen through societal trauma through these unfortunate mass shootings and many different situations that has happened in our society, right? And so that would be a societal trauma that we have experienced, right? And then we can experience trauma in our families and through our generations, right? There could be a generational trauma that our families have experienced, right? Whether it's a person in our family who hasn't done right by the family, or just societal. Even we can look at historical trauma going all the way back to slavery, right? So there's all kinds of ways that trauma can be experienced that's not just personally, and we need to understand and embrace that. It's also important to understand that the latter two would describe more of vicarious trauma, where we perhaps didn't experience directly to our person, but we've experienced it through watching, right? And so vicarious trauma is a thing that we experience as well. And so, and also in understanding trauma, no one is exempt from trauma. Somebody go ahead and drop that in the comments right now. Write it in the chat. No one is exempt from trauma. If you are alive, you most definitely probably have experienced a traumatic situation, right? Again, it could have been a car accident. It could have been watching a family or a loved one pass away, right? There are so many different things that happen where there's just impossible to be exempt from trauma. But sometimes what we do is normalize our trauma. And so because we've normalized our trauma, we don't realize that it's a traumatic experience that we're dealing with, right? And so when trauma is normalized, we go through life unaware that we've even experienced it. Some of our lived experiences were traumatic in nature, but because everybody has gone through it, or we have gotten used to our situations, we don't even realize it was traumatic or a toxic situation. This happens a lot to us, especially in families, right? And so we have to make sure that we look through our lives and we do the work to be able to look at what trauma has become normalized in our life. I use the example oftentimes that I'm from the Bronx, New York. And so we lived across the street from this park called Echo Park, and it was one of the most dangerous parks in the Bronx. And so oftentimes I would go to sleep to hearing fights and gunshots. It just became so normal to me, right? To the point where the sound of gunshots didn't necessarily startle me or scare me because I've heard it so many times. And I had to get to the point in realizing that when I moved, I had to realize, wait, hearing gunshots is not something that should be normal, right? But it became a normalized trauma in my life because that was what I grew up with. I heard it every night when I was sleeping, I heard it, in the middle of the night. And so it just became a normalized trauma in my life, right? And so it's also important to understand that trauma starts in childhood, even in utero, and stretches across the lifespan. Babies are being incubated in trauma. Pregnant, women being pregnant and toxic and abusive relationships relationships, drug addiction, mothers being in distress and stress during the carrying of their child causes the child to be incubated in a traumatic environment. Then, when babies are born, their very entry into the world could be traumatic as well, right? So it doesn't just disappear. Start in our childhood, and it doesn't just disappear. We have to understand that traumatized children grow up to be traumatized adults. Let me say that again. Traumatized children grow up to be traumatized adults if the work is not done to disrupt the trauma in childhood. And so some of you may have heard of the ACEs, or the adverse childhood experiences, right? The adverse childhood experiences study, or as we call it, the ACEs study, was a research study conducted by American Health Maintenance Organization, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And participants were recruited for the study and between 1995 and 1997, and have been in a long-term follow-up for health outcomes. The study demonstrated an association of adverse childhood experiences with health and social problems as an adult. And so the study is frequently cited as a notable landmark in epidemiology research, and has produced more than 50 scientific articles and more than 100 conferences and workshop presentations that look at the prevalence of the consequences of ACEs, right? ACEs outlines how trauma in our childhood affects us as we go into adulthood. It talks about how we can trace trauma throughout the lifespan, and how trauma unchecked can lead to early death, right? And if you look at this chart, you can see the chart of how ACEs work. So I'll jump really quickly, and I want you to take a moment and I want you to look at this. This is an ACEs assessment. Take a minute and just consider your ACEs. Remembering that this is just a screening tool. So we're not making any diagnoses off of this, but this is just a screening tool. But I want you to look at this and see how many things that perhaps you can say yes to, right? That would account for your ACEs. Feel free to take a screenshot of it or a picture of it so that you can go back and you can look at it later. Okay. And so what I want us to do, I'm going to give you a minute. I'm going to stop talking for a minute, and I want you to engage in this activity for me really quickly. It's called the Authentic Me activity. What you're going to do is you can get a piece of paper, or you can use your phone or a computer. I'm going to just stop talking for about a minute or two, and I'm going to give you time to reflect on one or two areas of your life. And then I want you to write down what behaviors, responses, or even activities you may engage in that have been out of survival or trauma identity. And here's my disclaimer. This could be a little bit triggering for you, and that is absolutely okay. If you feel like you can't do it, or you feel like you can't step away, that's okay. But I want you to take a minute, and I want you to consider just maybe one or two areas of your life. It could be your upbringing, it could be financial, it could be your health. And I want you to write down for yourself what behaviors, responses, or activities you may engage in out of survival or trauma identity. And then we're going to get into it in a second. You guys ready? Go. About 30 more seconds. All right, let's come back. So as you reflected on your areas, I'm going to tell you all a personal story and help you to reflect to see how this works and how trauma identity works. And then we're going to jump into it a little bit deeper. And so, for instance, I grew up in financial scarcity and insecurity. So was not always able to enjoy going to nice eateries and restaurants. When we could eat out, it was like at Applebee's or IHOP, right? And so it's all I knew. Now, I never really liked these restaurants, but as I got got older, I continued to eat there, even though my financial situation had changed. I had gotten used to these things being the only restaurants that I could afford. But one day something clicked, and I realized that my situation had changed and that I could go to other restaurants. And I actually enjoyed going to other restaurants. And so one day I decided that I was going to stop going to IHOP and Applebee's because I really didn't like them. And I started to go to restaurants that I enjoyed more, that perhaps cost more, because I had to change my mindset. The reason why I continue to go to IHOP and I continue to go to Applebee's is because of a scarcity mindset. It was a trauma identity that I took on. And that identity told me that I was broke and told me that I was still living in financial scarcity. And so I had to do the cheapest thing possible, right? Now, this ain't, if you love IHOP and Applebee's, I'm not coming for y'all. So don't come for me, right? But this is just a part of one of the ways I recognize that I have been living with a trauma identity. So as you go back and you look over the list that you wrote down, I want you to sit down and think about what are some ways that you have picked up a trauma identity? What are some behaviors and activities that you engaged in out of survival or this trauma identity that you don't need to do anymore, but that you continue to do it because it's just what you've always done. It's what you grew up in. It's how you've learned how to survive. And so it begins. Trauma starts in childhood, as we said earlier. It's familial experiences, it's school experiences, it's mental and psychological experiences, right? In a family, it could be an unsafe or clean home environment, constant yelling and fussing and fighting. It could be lack of validation or affirmation or affirmation and love, right? School experiences, it can be an unsafe or unclean school environment. It could be bullying and being outcasted, cyberbullying, which is at an all-time high these days. And it could be a lack of validation, affirmation, and love, even coming from the individuals, the adults that we trust in the school environment, right? Or it could be something that's more mental and psychological, which could be this depression. It could be a dysregulation. It could be chemical imbalances, right? There are many different things that can contribute to trauma and how it manifests itself in childhood. The key is what isn't dealt with and nurtured at the earliest age possible will become disordered. Let me say that again. What isn't dealt with and nurtured at the earliest age possible will become disordered. And so we have to fight hard that when we have these family experiences, or when we have these school experiences, or when there's mental and psychological issues and concerns, they cannot go unchecked. The longer and the more they go unchecked, the longer and the more severe they become disordered. And that could be with your children, that can even be with yourself. And so now imagine being a child, lacking love, security, and validation, feeling unwanted, like you don't belong and there's nowhere that's safe for you, and not receiving the nurturance that you need in order to heal. Take a moment and imagine that for a second. Then this child becomes an adult who lacks love, security, and validation, who feels unwanted, like you don't belong and nowhere is safe, right? As I look at this picture, what do you see in this picture? Somebody just go ahead and drop a couple of things in the comments for me. What do you see in this picture, right? I see phases of life, growth, and seeming maturity. If the little boy in the back is traumatized, but he hasn't been nurtured, it doesn't matter how put together adult male looks, he will always be that little boy in the back, just dressed up with a suit and a briefcase, right? Because again, traumatized children become traumatized adults. Nurturance and healing looks. Essentially, you remain the child with the adult body. And this is where the inner child comes into play, where even though you're walking around as an adult, you're doing all the adult things, but that inner child on the inside of you is screaming out. The inner child becomes the responder, trying to defend itself, right? On the adult. The mature self becomes suppressed. So you live your life like a hurt child in an adult's body. And this is how, for many people, the trauma identity develops. And so, identity and trauma, right? Identity formation is an important part of our development. It begins at birth and persists throughout our adulthood, all the way throughout our life. So our identity is always forming, our identity is always developing. It is up to us on what part of our identity is forming and developing, right? Your identity is who you are, it's your sense of self. It's the way that you think about yourself and the world around you, the way you are viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define you, right? And so identity development gets disrupted by trauma because survival kicks in and it takes precedence and it uses resources that are ordinarily allocated for normal development of the self. So while the resources that was supposed to be for normal development of ourself, it gets reallocated to this trauma identity. And so what happens is the trauma shifts the trajectory of our brain development because an environment characterized by fear and neglect, for example, causes different adaptations of brain activity than one of safety, than an environment of security and an environment of love. And so the earlier the distress on average, the more profound the effect will be. And so the brain begins to change. And all of this is important to understand because a person's trauma identity causes them to think, act, behave, and interact with the world accordingly. Just like we did that activity, and I told you guys about my dislike for IHOP and my dislike for Applebee's, right? But because I lived with this scarcity mindset, and that was part of my trauma identity, when I got older, I continued to act as if I was still living in a place of financial scarcity and going to some of the same places, even though I did not enjoy going there. Right. And so our behavior, how we think, and everything that we do manifests according to this new trauma identity that we have taken on. And so identifying the trauma identity, it's parts of me, not of me. It's about finding your authentic self. It's important that we identify our trauma identity so that we can rid ourselves of those parts of us that are not actually us. This takes time of reflection and introspection about our lives and the things that we do, places we go, and how we interact with the world that we've learned to do out of survival, right? And trauma, and not because it is truly our authentic self. To do this reflection work, we have to think critically about each area of our lives and evaluate if there's any parts of that area that is a result of survival and trauma or the authentic you. So I encourage you to go back and do that activity we did a little bit ago, but do it for the different areas of your life and try to identify is this a result of trauma or this is a result of the authentic me, right? And so there are things we do and perhaps places we go again out of survival because we have made it normalized. And so we want to make sure that we do some exploration. And so who am I anyway? When you look at this picture, what do you see? I see confusion. I see it's scary. I see parts that don't belong. I see incongruence. Reality is many of us look like this. When you are shaped by trauma emotionally, this is how you look. This is what your trauma identity looks like. On the outside, you may be put together, but inwardly, you are not. And whatever you are emotionally shapes who you are personality wise. How I think will lead to what I feel, will lead to how I behave, right? So the emotional you and then the behavioral interactional part of you. And then what happens is you have developed a trauma brain. And if you have a trauma brain, then your identity becomes that very thing. And so the way forward, we have to learn to shed the fragments. As we can see, many of us hold parts that have been shaped by trauma identity, again, from that activity we did earlier. I identify these as trauma fragments. And identity and trauma fragments are the parts of us that we pick up along the way, and trauma to help us to cope, right? To help us to survive. That we may have been forced into based on the situation. And so these are the trauma fragments that like that picture, it makes up many different parts of us. The goal is to be able to rid ourselves of those inauthentic identities and fragments and get to the authentic us, who we truly are. When we are able to rid ourselves the identity fragments, it helps us to stand whole as a whole person, having gotten rid of all of the fragments. And so it's about generations. It's about healing individuals to heal communities. The ultimate goal is to heal generations and to heal our communities. But to get to this place, we have to begin with healing ourselves, right? It's healing me to heal we. healing individuals to heal communities. There's no secret that healing communities of color is needed in particular, right? Healing communities is not just a catchy or trendy saying. It's the way forward. A community cannot move forward and reach the communal goal until the individuals of that community are in a place of resilient strength and mental and emotional health. You can think of this as your family, right? The family has to do individual work to heal so that the entire family can get a place to healing. That is the goal. If we continue to walk around with a fragmented concept of who we are and the strength we harbor, then confusion, hopelessness, and a host of other maladaptive and just wrongful behaviors and symptoms will affect and determine the collective identity of our children, of our relationships, of our families, and ultimately of our communities. But if individually we are whole and have authentic identities, then collectively we will too. Let me say that again. If individually we are whole and have authentic identities, then collectively we will too. There are many things that we can blame for this unity in our families and our communities, but we can't get stuck on those things. Our unity requires our authenticity, and it requires us to collectively heal by individually doing our work. And so we have to learn to be active participants and not passive spectators. We have to get active in our personal work. We have to show up for our personal work, right? We can't just sit back and we can't just continue to know. Some of us get so caught up in a knowing and we don't do anything to act. We can't get so caught up in a knowing that we stay there and we do nothing to move forward and act. So it is time for us to get active and not passive, right? Whether that's you making sure that you're going through and you're reshaping your identity, you're getting rid of the fragments, you're going to therapy, doing what you have to do so that you can be a healthier and whole you and not continuing to be a passive bystander or a passive spectator in your story and in your situation. So how do we get active? I'm so glad you asked, right? Therapy. Let's break the stigma that and go into therapy, right? We got to break the stigma. It's holding us back from our collective healing. Calling out and confronting internal toxicity and familial toxicity, addressing issues and not ignoring, more programming within our communities instead of waiting for things to come to us, right? We have to get active and actually do some work. And so I want to go over this will with you really quickly. I want you to go ahead and screenshot this. This is a great way to figuring out who you are outside of your trauma so that you can re-identify and reimagine you, right? And so it looks at identifying what triggers, then what glimmers you, stop thinking, do, befriending yourself, people, places, and things, and seek help. So let's talk about it. Triggers are those things that set us off for failure, right? The glimmers are those things that set us up for success. So what are the things that set you up for success? What are your glimmers, right? Don't react, but respond. Many of us are good at reacting, but not very good at responding. When we learn how to respond instead of react, what it does is it rewires our brain and it pauses that inner child so the adult, mature you can take center stage and actually respond. With your friendships, get to know them, what they like and dislike, right? Like you would do with friends, you would get to know them, you would get to know what their likes and dislikes are, what makes them mad and happy, what foods they like, their personal style. Do these same things for you. Get to know you. Get to know what you like and dislike. Get to know what your personal style is so that you can show up for you better, more authentically, right? And revamping what I call your nouns, right? Your nouns are your people, your places, and your things. To say revamping your nouns, right? Because our trauma also causes us to flock to certain people, places, and things. So, what are your new people, places, and things? What are your nouns? What nouns do you have currently in your life that are a result of this trauma identity that you need to overcome and that you need to redo so that you can get to a better place? And last but not least, while doing all of this, seek help. There may be things you don't even recognize as part of your trauma identity, but a therapist can help you to do so if you need to. I want you to go ahead, take a screenshot of this will, take a picture of this will, and I want you to go through and I want you to do this exercise for you during your time. If you know, I invite you right now, drop in the comments what some of your glimmers are, right? Drop in the comments what brings you meaning. What do you know that are all your core values? What are you passionate about? What brings you joy and lights you up? What makes your inner child light up to replay, right? These are the things that we need to explore and that we need to get to so that we can re-identify and reimagine us so that the trauma us doesn't take over, so that the trauma us doesn't take precedence, but that the authentic identity of who we truly are is the one that takes over. And so go ahead, drop some of your answers in the comments. I would love to go through and read your comments and even have some conversation with each other. So you may be able to give each other some ideas, right? And so that's what I have for you today. I hope that you found this presentation helpful and you found some tools and you got two good activities that you can engage in order to help you to re-identify and reimagine you and not live in a trauma identity, because you are truly not your trauma. That is not who you are. That is something that happened to you, but it's not who you are. And so I'll offer you really quickly some free resources. I wrote a free ebook, 8 mental health quick tips while navigating uncertain times. You can go ahead to bit.ly/oasis email, all caps, and you'll be able to just put in your information and you'll be able to download the ebook. It's just some quick tips that I put together that have been helpful and useful for people when they find that they're navigating uncertain times or they're going through tough situations. I also want to let you know that I just released a book last February of 22. And so my book is officially 1 year old and it's called Jumpstart Your Journey to Mental Wellness, Strategies and Tools to Living Your Well Life. I am so proud of this book. This book has already gone all over the nation. I've created coaching programs and everything about it. I've gotten rave reviews over this book. It is basically a 8-step guide in order to help you to get your life. There is a workbook that goes along with it, but I encourage you to go ahead and get this book. If you're looking for tools, if you're not sure how to start your journey, if you're looking for a way to start your journey, or if you have family and friends and loved ones who are trying to start their journey, this is the book for you. It is literally, I call it a tool in your arsenal on your journey towards wellness. It's an easy read. It has practical steps. It's very conversational. And so I invite you to go to bit.ly/journey to mental wellness, all lowercase, so you can read a little bit more about what's in the book and so that you can grab your copy today. Grab a copy for you, grab a copy for a friend. But I guarantee you that when you pick up that book and when you're done the book and you put it down, if you go through the steps and you actually take your time through it, you will walk out with some tools and even with a game plan on what I need to do next in order to continue or jumpstart my journey towards mental wellness. And last but not least, I invite you to follow me. I am on Instagram and Facebook. Instagram is at Oasis Wellness Group. Facebook is also Oasis Wellness Group, just to keep up with what it is that I have going on. For many mental health tips, I jump on and do some live videos. And that's all I have for you. So I want to thank you so much for joining my presentation today. I hope that it was great for you and that you enjoy the rest of your time at the summit. Be blessed.